So overall, I would probably give it a 2 out of 5 stars. Hello everyone, welcome back to La La Land. Today we are giving the awaited Wuthering Heights review. I actually haven't watched the movie yet because today it is the 9th, but I did finish reading the book, rereading the book, so I wanted to kind of give a summary of it before I watch the movie and maybe some thoughts about what I've seen so far just before I actually have the experience of seeing it in the theaters. So the first time I read this book was in 2022, and I was still kind of in the early stages of my reading journey, so I didn't really get it at the time, but one of my friends loves this book, and after this reread I can really understand why. But at the first time of reading, it was just mostly confusing because, one, there is a lot of regional accents in the book, like a Yorkshire accent, maybe more rural. And then the other thing that I couldn't really get into was, I think the story was a little bit confusing because there's a lot of moving parts, and then it kind of is told through unreliable narrator sort of character of Nellie / Ellen Dean. But she is the one who is framing this entire story of the families that live at Wuthering Heights. So this time around, it was much easier to follow because I was already familiar with the characters, but I also was able to follow like a family web. I actually drew one because I was getting lost, but then after, maybe like 5 chapters, I remembered kind of who was related to who and like what happened. And I think a lot of people are apprehensive of reading books from this time period. Like, I think it's the Victorian era. I'm not an expert, but a lot of people may say that the language is inaccessible. But honestly, I feel like the only really inaccessible part was the regional accents, like I was talking about. But there is like full pages and websites with translations. And the way that Emily Bronte writes that specific character, his name's Joseph, with this regional accent, it's kind of just like a phonetic spelling of what he sounds like. So you can kind of get used to it if you're following with a guideline, or you keep reading it out loud to yourself. So I actually found that to be fine this time. I think one of the content creators that I watch, maybe a booktuber, she described this book as just drama, and I think it kind of is just drama, like a lot of other novels from this time period. Like, we're just kind of describing the situations that these people are going through, and like it's kind of even told in a very gossipy perspective. So it's actually quite entertaining if you haven't read it, but I might agree that if you're not someone who's reading a lot of classic literature, it's probably hard to start because the language is a little bit different. So recapping the story, the name of the book is Wuthering Heights, and that's because this big house is called Wuthering Heights. Back in that time, the land had its own name. So, like, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, Bingley buys Netherfield, or he rents Netherfield. And Netherfield is not only his house, but also the land around it. And they have, like, fields for hunting, they have the estate, they have all the servants' quarters, that's all connected. But in this book, Wuthering Heights is this house, and the neighboring house is called Thrushcross Grange. And these two houses, there's a lot of drama between the people who live at either one of them. And so the story of Wuthering Heights is interesting because it's actually kind of 2 stories in one. It is a story told through the perspective of Nellie, who is a housekeeper, and she used to work at both of these houses, so she is very familiar with what had happened. But then at the same time, it's actually telling you the story of Heathcliff and Catherine, and then also their descendants. So those are the main focuses of the story. The original people who lived at Wuthering Heights were the Earnshaw's family. So this included like the 2 parents, Catherine, Hindley, and these 2 were siblings. And then one day, Mr. Earnshaw basically comes home with Heathcliff, and he's like this boy who is on the streets. He's like speaks a different language, but he basically adopts him, and then like Heathcliff grows up with Catherine and Hindley. There's a lot that goes on, of course, that I can't really get into without spoiling too much. But a big focus of the story is that Heathcliff is very noticeably othered by society. It's because he's, dark-skinned in this European society. He speaks a different language when he is first adopted, and he doesn't really have like a background. They don't know where he came from. They just named him Heathcliff after like a son that they had lost. So a lot of the story is about him kind of being ostracized, but then how does like Catherine and Hindley, who grew up with him, how do they like react to him being this other person in the society? And there is a love story involved, but it's kind of sort of misunderstanding situation where Catherine gets married to someone else, but she actually was in love with Heathcliff this whole time. But, she felt that because of the rules of society, she was unable to basically express her love for him. And then the second half of the story is kind of what happens because of this choice, and how Heathcliff, he kind of takes out his anger on the rest of her family and her descendants and the people who are involved with these two houses because of what had happened with Catherine when she said that she didn't love him. And so a lot of people don't consider this a romance, or they think that it's not supposed to focus on this aspect, but I would argue that the romance is actually a big part of the book. I mean, that doesn't mean that, it's a healthy relationship or that, the characters are right or wrong. It's just that there's this motive that drives a lot of the characters, and sometimes it is love, and maybe the way that people act are not necessarily appropriate or proper for society, but it's a way that they can express their emotions. So obviously the movie hasn't come out yet, but I've already seen some discourse about it just because of the casting as well as what the trailers have been portraying. And I do have some thoughts about that, so I figured I would talk about it before I actually see the movie. I think the biggest one is about the casting of Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff. So it's pretty controversial because in the book, Heathcliff is described as dark-skinned. Like I said, they use racial slurs against him, and they kind of compare him to the devil multiple times. Everyone pretty much like hates him except for Catherine. So it's very obvious that there's something about him that is different from the rest of society. Everyone in this story besides him, like they're described with like fair skin, light colored eyes, everything like that. But he consistently is described as dark skinned, dark hair, dark eyes. And so a lot of the discourse around the casting was that Jacob Elordi, well, he is white first of all, so people were arguing that, they should have cast a person of color. Then there's another contingent of people who are saying that in Emily Bronte's society, being dark-skinned is just like being tan. Like they didn't have this perception of race the same way that we do now. And he was just probably some other type of European that wasn't English or something like that. And while I can understand both sides of this argument when you put it like that, I think it is still a little bit disingenuous to cast Jacob because he does pretty much look like every other person that's in this like society. And so if the story is about Heathcliff being ostracized and othered for, not fitting in, I feel like there could be a easier way to make a very clear distinction between why that is. Also, the fact that both Jacob Elordi and Margot Robbie are Australian and white is pretty interesting because they're actually more similar than like they're supposed to be different. I don't know. I also saw that some of the other characters were cast without respect to race. So like I believe Edgar and Nellie, which is also interesting because now you're kind of race blind casting, and usually I don't have an issue with this, but I think in the context of this story specifically, it could be a little bit problematic because now we are kind of deliberately ignoring that aspect of Heathcliff's character and now casting some other characters who don't contribute to the romance of the story, but casting them as people of color just like for fun. So I mean, I'm not upset about them being cast as people of color instead of like white Europeans, but they could have also cast someone else for Heathcliff that wasn't Jacob or that was a person of color. You know what I mean? Some other criticisms I saw were that Margot Robbie was too old to play Catherine, and I think that can be kind of true because a lot of the story, it's taking place when Catherine and Heathcliff are like really young. Like she's like 18. And then a second part of the story is like about her kid and his kid. And they're also very young. I think that has some merit, but I also don't think it matters as much as maybe the aspect of race or othering in this story. And finally, the trailers have seemed to focus mostly on the original Heathcliff and Catherine, which I don't think I've actually watched any other adaptation of Wuthering Heights, but it's actually only around half of the full story. So I'm wondering if, there's going to be flashbacks to that era and then it'll go back to the present, or, explain what happened with their kids, because that is kind of like the second half of the book. Or if it's just focusing on that and then we're losing out on this, resolution of what happens at Wuthering Heights after Catherine's death. I also did think that the trailer made it appear like the movie was very sexualized, and I feel like the book isn't actually like that. Like obviously there's very intense moments of passion that occur between the characters, but in this like Victorian era, there's like different ways that you can portray that, and I think the costuming and the framing of the trailers have made it seem more like overtly sexual than it actually is. So we'll see if that happens in the actual movie. I know it's rated R, so I'm wondering if, this interpretation is really a faithful adaptation or if it's more of a interpretation. But then I'm interested to see how exactly she interpreted it. So the next time you see me will be after I've watched the movie, and I'll give my final thoughts then. I'm a little bit scared because it is also very long. Maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised besides the criticisms that I already talked about. So, see you then. Hey, I'm back. I don't exactly remember what I said in the pre-watching the movie clip because that was a few weeks ago, but I have now watched Wuthering Heights, directed by Emerald Fennell. Here's my review. So overall, I would probably give it a 2 out of 5 stars, but if I watched it from a different perspective, it could maybe reach up to 3 out of 5 stars. There were a few things that I did actually like/enjoy, and the rest were questionable. And I believe Emerald Fennell said it herself that this movie is supposed to be an interpretation with the quotation marks, which is why I think I can give it a little bit of leniency on that end. However, as a movie, it was still lacking a lot of things that I wished she had put in. So first things first, I would say if I hadn't read the book before, I would think that the movie's pretty interesting, at least. The love story between Heathcliff and Catherine is semi-accurate in the way that they portrayed it. I think there is just more creative liberties taken with how they express their love in the film. There were actually some pretty funny scenes. I know Margot Robbie's pretty good at comedy, like physical comedy, so I was actually pleasantly surprised by that. And a few emotional scenes, like I didn't tear up, but I could see how they might be emotional for someone who didn't know what the book was about. Addressing the Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff thing, I already talked a little bit about the race aspect of this book and how I think it's disingenuous to not cast Heathcliff as someone who is more visibly darker skinned, a man of color perhaps. But Jacob took that role, he was in it, and I actually was kind of bored by him. I don't think he's very attractive as Heathcliff. I know he's not necessarily supposed to be, but when he comes back from making his fortune, he kind of just looked the same to me. And it's probably somewhat due to Emerald Fennell just liking Jacob Elordi. I never actually watched Saltburn, but I know that he's in that as well. So if that's the case, then I'm happy for her, and I guess I'm happy for him. I will say, though, his acting as the creature from Frankenstein in the new Guillermo del Toro movie is actually really good, and I think he does fit that character much better than he had fit Heathcliff. Margot Robbie as Catherine was not horrible, but I do see now the criticisms for her age. I think I said earlier I didn't mind as much, and I don't think it takes away too much from the story, but there's just like some scenes where she's pretending to act like a teenager and she just has her like normal face, which I'm not trying to say she's old. She's not old, but you can clearly tell she's not a teenager. I was also a little confused as to if Emerald Fennell purposely aged them up a little bit, because it seemed like they never explicitly said their ages in this movie. Like in the book, Catherine is around 19 when she dies. Next, I think a lot of people were turned away from the very like sexually explicit vibe of the trailers and promo, but then upon actually watching the movie, I don't even think it was really that crazy. Like, there are obviously characters having sex, and there are some very unexpected characters having sex. Like, why were Joseph and Zillah having sex? I don't think they even like interact with each other in the actual book. Also, Joseph is like the religious, like very rural country man. Like, he's God-fearing. I don't think he would be doing that with an unmarried woman who's not his own wife. But like, besides that, the scenes where there were sex being shown, it was never anything like explicit being shown. So then it got me thinking, like, was the point of the movie to like clickbait a little bit? I don't know. Also, a lot of other people were talking about this on Twitter, but for the character of Isabella, they kind of put her in this like BDSM moment with Heathcliff after they get married, and he's like treating her as a dog basically. It's a very interesting fetish that was being portrayed, and I don't know really what the point of that was except for shock value maybe, but I felt like it didn't really contribute anything to that story. Another thing I was confused about with this movie was, if it's supposed to be a period piece, then I think Emerald failed at that, because the costuming is just completely all over the place. Like, Margot Robbie's like wearing all this very intense like makeup in all of the scenes. All of her dresses look like they came off of like Shein. I don't know. It's very weird. But if she meant to only base it off of the period which it takes place, which is Victorian England, and wanted to put her own, I guess, stylistic choices into the costuming and set design, I think it makes a little more sense, but some of the stuff is still crazy. Similarly, the houses kind of looked like out of place. Wuthering Heights was a little bit more accurate in my mind as to what I thought it was going to look like, at least. But then Cora decided to join. But then Thrushcross Grange just kind of looked like President Snow's house from the Catching Fire movie. So it was very confusing. Sorry, she knocked over the camera. I actually did like the physical setting that it was taking place in. So, there's like cliffs that were pictured in a lot of the scenes, as well as these like thorny bramble. And that is kind of what I picture when I see those two houses in my mind. Like, one of them is, this like kind of haunted, gothic mansion that is surrounded by mountains and it's kind of out of the way. But then the other one is more closer to town. There's rolling fields around it. Horses are riding around. So I thought that Emerald actually did that well. The soundtrack was interesting to me because I actually think the production of Charlie XCX music was very fitting to the tone of the story, the themes of like being haunted and this like very tragic toxic love. But it was a little bit jarring to hear her voice like randomly between people talking or people like basically giving their dialogue. But when she wasn't actually singing, the music part of it did feel like it fit with the rest of the movie. I think part of that is because it seems like Emerald Fennell specifically chose Charlie XCX probably because they have a very similar artistic interpretation slash style that they were looking for, which kind of explains a little bit more of why the movie was like that. I think the pacing of the movie was a little slow and it felt really long, even though nothing really was happening, so I was very confused. And they only told half of the story of Wuthering Heights, which I guess is the more popular half about the original Catherine and the original Heathcliff. But I wanted to see the second part of the story that kind of explains how after Catherine dies, Heathcliff kind of starts inflicting psychological torture on her descendants and her family and is haunted by her, but also continues to live in that house where he grew up, the Wuthering Heights house. And all of this is driven by basically his love and his madness for her, and it definitely causes ripple effects across their family like lines because they are so intertwined. But it seems like no one cares about that part of the story. At least I haven't heard of any movie that adapts that part. I was also disappointed that they wrote out a lot of the characters or they combined them into one. So for example, Catherine has a brother named Hindley Earnshaw in the books, but then he's just like non-existent in this one, as well as the Lintons, Edgar and Isabella in the movie. It's a dad and his daughter, but in the actual books they're siblings, and then like they have parents, but they don't have parents in the movie, which also is weird that Isabella is Edgar's ward or child in this movie, because then considering the age gaps, which weren't that crazy in the book, like, you know, they were teens when they got married, Edgar and Catherine, of course, but if Edgar is of the age where he has a child that's almost Catherine's age, then he must be like 40 or 50 in this movie, and she's probably in her 20s. I don't know. The director also changed it so that Nellie kind of orchestrated the separation of Heathcliff and Catherine. So in the books, it's kind of told from her point of view, where she is overhearing people talk, and then she's present in situations where Catherine is admitting her love for Heathcliff, but then she notices Heathcliff is outside listening. And while that part was done correctly in the movie, I think it was framed in a way that like she purposely knew and wanted Heathcliff to run away and kind of like destroyed their relationship or something. Which, I mean, it's fine if Nellie is, you know, quote unquote evil, but I thought it was a little bit weird because she was one of like 3 people of color that were cast in this movie. One other being like Edgar, I think. So I don't know, that just felt a little off to me, because there's really no other like conflict besides Edgar not liking Heathcliff and then Nellie, like, I guess, meddling in Catherine's affairs and stuff. So overall, I don't think I would watch this movie again, and I don't think I want to watch any other Emerald Fennell movies. But I thought it was a very interesting experience to see what an adaptation is like from the eyes of a director who is purposely not trying to make it book accurate, but more so choosing, you know, specific parts that she wants to adapt and call it an interpretation. I think it's very interesting, like, what are the boundaries of adaptations, and like what does it mean to take creative liberties versus like just showing the sanctity of a story, or like not capturing the essence of a story. And I'm sure people have written like papers and books about like what adaptation means, but yeah, I think this is actually a really good thought exercise for trying to understand it. So yeah, that's the end of this video. I don't want to talk more about this movie if I have to, because I don't want to have to think about it, but I'm sure I will continue to make book/movie reviews, you know, as things come out and I read them or watch them. I did watch Hamnet recently and I am really intrigued by the book, so maybe I'll get into that. And if you have any ideas for videos I should make next, let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe if you want to see more. And I'll see you again in La La Land. Bye!